Welcome, everyone. It's lovely to see you all here. Thank you for joining us for the second College of Asia and the Pacific 2024 Professorial Lecture. The lectures, as you know, honour and celebrate the outstanding achievements of our colleagues who have been recently promoted to Professor. So if that's not what you're here to hear, you're in the wrong room. But stay, because it'll be fantastic. My name's Helen Sullivan. I have the great privilege of being Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific. And as we begin, I would like to acknowledge and celebrate the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and acknowledge that the land we live, work and play on has never been ceded. Tonight, as I say, we gather to celebrate and recognise Professor Nicolas Lemay-Hebert's contributions to research and teaching at the college. It's always really sad to me that the guy who gets to speak, or the person who gets to speak, they end up sitting on their own in the front. It's quite alarming, but I'm sure that will be fine. Nick, as many of you will know, is based in our International Relations Department of the Coral Bell School, and his research interests include state building and intervention issues in the Asia Pacific and beyond. He's particularly interested in local resistance to international interventions and the political economy of interventions. His lecture this evening will provide an insight into the United Nations system of colour coding for security zones and the impacts of this on local communities. Nick will speak for about 40 minutes. There will be an opportunity to ask questions, so please think about the questions as Nick is speaking. I'm sure it will generate a huge amount of discussion. And with that, it is my very great pleasure to welcome Professor Nicolas Lemay-Hebert to the lectern.
All right. Thank you so much, Helen, for the introduction. I'm really happy to see you all. I can obviously recognize some of you. And it's great to be able to count on your friendship and your support. I've been really nervous in the last couple of weeks, as my friends know, more nervous than usual. And I was wondering, why is that the case? You know, like it's not my first rodeo. I've been doing those kind of talks before. And I guess it's because also I've attended a couple of other professorial lectures before. And it seems to be, rightly so, I think, the celebration of existing work, right? Like, so people are presenting what they have done and accomplished, and people celebrate this. Well, in this case, it's a bit slightly different, right? So what I'm suggesting to you is that I'm presenting what is really a work in progress. It's a current passion, probably almost an obsession of mine in the last year or two. But it's also a ARC, so Australian Research Council project, discovery project. And I'm working on this with colleagues of mine. So they are Ari Jerems, who used to be a postdoc with us, is now in Perth. Marsha Henry from LSE, and now actually in Belfast. Jonathan Fisher from Birmingham, and Floria Wigan from LSE. So some of what I'll be presenting, I'll be saying the usual, I am interested in this and this and that. But what I really mean is we, probably. And most of the different colors, I've been doing the field work in collaboration with some of my colleagues. So for instance, the theoretical framework with the red color coding I've done with Ari, the green discussion with Marsha, the blue with Jonathan, and the black and white with Florian. So let me see if this works. All right, so first of all, I would like also to acknowledge the contribution of the many co-authors I've been able to work with in the past couple of years, or at least since the start, actually, of my career. I don't think I think everyone is listed there. If it's not, you know, I really do apologize. I've been able to work with an amazing set of co-authors, including my past PhD students. I'm really proud of this. So I would like to thank all of my co-authors for, coping with me, bearing with me in the process, and I think making me a better person and a better scholar as well. But before I start with where it's all started, I would also like to thank my mentors in general, especially, well, I guess half of the department is pretty much my mentors or been in some kind of mentoring role for me. But I will also like, maybe he will be listening, but my first professor that I really bonded with, I guess, in my Bachelor of International Law that I did at the University of Montreal. His name is Daniel Turp. So maybe he's listening. He's like emeritus professor now. So maybe, he's just enjoying the vacation and retirement. But if he's listening, I would like to thank him. He's the first one who gave me the talk, what I now know as the talk, which is like, you know what, Nick, you can do better. Go out there, go to Paris. I'll be supporting you, and I remember as a young student that I had never envisaged such a future for me, going to Paris, doing my master's degree, my PhD in Paris, and ending up doing a professorial lecture in such an esteemed university as the ANU. So this is a tradition that I've been, I think, continuing from time to time in my teaching, giving the talk to some of my students, and I'm really happy to recognize some of my students, Ben there and others, so I'm really happy. Maybe it's going to be your turn, like in a few years' time, you'll be there doing the professorial lecture, so keep that in mind. All right, so where it all started, this is this map. So as I said, it's a work in progress, but that was a kind of an encounter, fortress encounter in 2016. So I was working on the reparations for the cholera outbreak in Haiti, so working with people making a claim against the UN for bringing cholera in Haiti. And a UN official gave me that map, saying basically, you should avoid specific areas. Here is the map that we use for our own UN personnel. For me, it was a fascinating insight into UN interventions. Why? Because the yellow zone, and I'll be talking about yellow in a minute, is actually covering something like 70% of Port-au-Prince. So I'm thinking, wow, this kind of geography, this security code is not something only reserved to the red zone that you can see in the middle, in the top corner here, that is Cité Soleil, that is famously known as one of the most dangerous places on earth, according to the UN at the time and all this. So that everyone knew about it, but we didn't know the yellow zone and how big and spreading it was at that time. So this was my starting point, and then I started looking into this, published a first article about this, about the yellow zone, and then figure out and found all these other colors and maps. So I'll be presenting the different colors and the different maps one by one. But before that, let's talk a little bit about the meanings of colors, shall we? So, so we spent a lot of time all together on trying to kind of figure out the literature on the meaning of color. And I think the starting point to this conversation is that symbolism of colors cannot be apprehended separately and cannot be defined in the absolute. So do not try to find an absolute understanding of what red would convey would mean. It's a social history, right? And it will vary by the actors, but also in the different time frames. And more importantly, we have to take them into consideration in the kind of relationship between the different colors. So if we want to try to understand red for UN security mapping, as I'll be discussing, we need to have an understanding of what green means. Is attached. For the blue zone that I'll be talking about, it's designed as also a way to contrast with red zones, okay? Or white and black is another example. One of the authors, a scholar that I found fascinating on this is a French scholar that is now in his 80s. Michel Pastoureau is actually a medieval historian, but also did on the almost side, but now it became a real part of his contribution to science, a social history of color. So he has this amazing Princeton University Press collection of books that is a history of each color, tracing from the Middle Ages to today. And for Michel Pastoureau, there is no transcultural truth of color. Do not try to find the truth in the color. It's actually, you have to understand it through the codes, through how people embody it and live that color. Also, we have to understand also that colors went through different epochs and different transitions and understandings. So at first, in ancient times, color was defined as matter, right? So what I mean by matter is that it's basically understood as a material envelope that is covering the body. This is how color is actually perceived, okay? And it's actually rooted in the etymology of the word itself. Then it came to be understood as light, or fraction of light, following Newton's contribution, and then opening what we now understand as the spectrum of colors. And it's only recently that we started thinking of it as a sensation or as perception, okay? Following, for instance, Goethe's theory of colors. This focus on perception carried a lot of ramifications for cartography. It became a kind of a focus on the map readers, so the people who are receiving the map, and the map readers' perception of the colors, the hues, the values, the saturation. And the focus then became on how the colors reflects the map maker's original intent or not, and how it reflects the reality of what is mapped. Our approach, or my approach, is quite distinct here, right? We are interested in situating the use of the colors in a specific system of meaning, okay? And the system of meaning that we are interested in is the universalization of the traffic light system, okay? That I think carried a lot of ramifications, a lot of understanding for how we are understanding security maps. So it emerged, the traffic light system, the urban one, in 1868 in London. And by the beginning of the 20th century, in UK, France, and Germany, we had different traffic lights. At that time, there were only two colors. So the yellow was not introduced yet. It became only something in the 1940s, 50s. But what is interesting here is that red has always been somehow more than that, but associated with danger, at least since the 19th century or so. But yellow was never something about, didn't carry the meaning of permission to proceed or freedom, okay? Actually, green, it was a color, according to Pastoral, that was associated with disorder or transgression. It was not also understood as the opposition of red. It's only through the traffic light system that we saw that. The opposition to red was white from very ancient times, white and red, and then it has been blue since halfway through the Middle Ages. Okay, so this association of red and green is something that became prominent through actually Newton's understanding of the spectre. And also, more importantly, maybe, is Michel-Eugène Chevreuil's theory of simultaneous contrast of complementary colors in 1839. And so this is when green and red became associated together. So the universalization of the traffic light system is also something quite fascinating. There's no much resistance to it. A friend of mine alerted to one little episode that happened. I might be corrected by someone in the audience, so I know that there's a lot of experts of China. So let me try this, and if you don't think that this is the right story that happened, let me know. But I've looked it up in the newspapers at that time. So it seems like one group of the Red Guards, so the vanguards of China's new cultural revolution in 1966, decided that red was now the color for go, and green for stop, right? So obviously, the initiative was not supported by the Chinese government, but just kind of a few zealots who decided that, they really wanted to continue the revolution. And it was meant to be a new signal for traffic, but also a new signal for the spread of communism in the region. The campaign left, according to the newspaper's article, left the city in utter disorder, right? With guards installed in almost every intersection of the city trying to, obviously push people to do the right thing. And after discussions, the authorities decided to keep the conventional traffic light intact. So I don't know if there's other examples that you know of resistance to the traffic light system, but what is important here is that most people will be able to read the traffic light system and understand what it means. And that's why this has been adopted in mapping practices. So what we use here is the 6-color system. So we have identified 6 different colors that are used by the UN to understand or to map different interventions. We've decided to focus on the UN because I've been working on UN peacekeeping for quite a while. It's a good entry point into how an intervention, an actor behind intervention will be using color codes to map places. We could have used the US, we could have used Australia, but it's also a question of access, right? American embassies don't tend to be sharing those maps. They don't tend to be answering questions, even if they have very interesting color codes themselves in their own mapping. So as I said, figured out 6 colors that are used by the UN: the red, yellow, and green, blue, white, and black. It's more fortuitous than really by design, but this is also the first order of colors according to Aristotle. That is the first known theory of colors. And so for Professorial, these 6 colors actually have dominated Western societies since the Middle Ages. They are the 6 most important colors in a sense. This is also, interestingly enough, translated to the different population preferences and across cultures, right? So if you ask a question in current surveys to population in Europe, Canada, US, Australia, what is your favorite color? 50%, a little bit more than 50%, would say blue. You know? So if you do a survey right now, yes, 50% of you would have blue as a favorite color. And then it's followed by green or red. I don't know if that maps out onto your own experience here. In Japan, it is red, followed by black and white. In China and India, yellow is normally the preferred color. In Muslim countries, it tends to be green. But what is interesting is that the color is intimately cultural, obviously, following Pastoral and others, but the preferences tend to operate within the 6 color system. It doesn't really carry any ramifications for us in terms of security mapping, but it does mean that they have adopted colors that tend to be important for many cultures or can be read easily by local populations as well. So what we found is that color-coded spaces and all these color-coding mapping has salient ramifications for how they are imagined as spaces, intervened upon, but also experienced by the local population, something I'll be talking about when I mention the color green. So here, and this is, I think, the little twist with the mapping and the cartography that I'm trying to do here, is that the color coding is not only a part of adorning part of the maps. You just don't put the color just because it's nice and beautiful. It carries meaning, right? It's a mental ordering of space. It's a visual image to produce more abstract truths. And this type of maps is known as thematic mapping. This is something fairly recent. And so the term itself seems to be originated from Germany in the 1960s and 70s. But there were thematic maps before. I'll be presenting you some of the early examples of thematic maps with color codes. But these thematic maps are very interesting because they are basically graphic geographical essays, right? They will be overlaying an argument through the colors or through other things. But in here, I'm interested in the color codes. Through color codes, they will be adding an argument to the map, right? And they are understood then in distinction with what you normally know as reference or general maps. So basically, what we are trying to do and to say is that security mapping is thematic mapping. It's an argument that you can read, that you can try to develop. It's also seen as such by the local population. It's difficult to trace color coding in thematic mapping when it all started. Most importantly, it is linked to the fact that it was expensive and difficult to do this consistently in mapping, apart from manuscript mapping. They say that usually thematic mapping will be really the heyday, the area where it really, the time when it really started growing will be around 1850. Okay. So color coding so now you'll have nice little maps to look at altogether. So I won't bore you with more theory. So the colors here that's not a thematic map, right? That's a general map. So that's a map I found at in my recent stay in the Paris archives, the archives of the National. And what you can see here is a map of Port-au-Prince. I'm interested in Haiti, after all. And what you see is basically what you would normally understand as a thematic, not a thematic, a general or reference map, right? The representation of buildings here, there's a code for this that comes from the engineering schools most of the time. So they are coming from engineers, naval engineers. And you will see that red here is used for the buildings built to last. Okay, so that's a one code to say. Normally, in this map, you don't really see that, but you will have buildings in black that will be temporary or built in wood, right? In this case, you have blue used for governmental buildings, most likely, as I can see that. And so sometimes, again, in other maps, you will have yellow for projected work, something that's going to happen. So these kind of codes translate in different cultures. There's an amazing work that's been done on the same kind of color codes for these reference maps in East Asian maps. Recently, there was an amazing book on this. And so here, this is not a thematic map. It's color codes, so that's interesting for me, but it's not an argument on a map. You understand? It's just showing you, through color codes, but showing you what Port-au-Prince in the middle of the 18th century would look like. Okay? So red doesn't mean danger, or blue doesn't mean the UN, or doesn't mean peace, or doesn't mean anything else. So the early maps, thematic maps and color-coded thematic mapping will be focusing on physical or environmental distributions of specific features. There's a number of these. If you're interested, we can talk about this. But I decided to select as my first point of contact here, Marie Lemasson-Le Golfe. So this map is in French. It's known as Esquisse d'un tableau général du genre humain. And in 1787. It's sold, if you can actually buy it online. I was really thinking really hard potentially of buying it, but yeah, my wife is here, maybe, I don't know. Here she is. I don't know. A conversation for later, right? But it's a bit expensive. So it's sold as the first modern anthropological map and considered an important contribution to the emergence of thematic mapping, as I said. So here, what you can see is signs depicting the religions, the forms ranging from beautiful to ugly. When I'm saying this, obviously, do understand that this is the language she uses, not my language. And also the customs, so what is in French, mœurs, of the population. So they are categorized, if you really read it, and there's a little explanation here, as learned societies, living in society, savage, polygamous, nude, human, or cruel. And then the color used here is to categorize the skin colors. But more profoundly, it is to know the level of degeneration of certain races. Again, that's the use of the term here. So this is a good example of, again, what I'm saying. There's an argument on that map. We are using color codes to be able to make an argument about and structuring the space. It's a geographical essay. Another example, and I'm really quite proud of that found, is something I found again in the archives in Paris, is an early color-coded thematic map of Port-au-Prince that was made circa 1800. So again, we are at least a good 50 years before the real kind of emergence and use of thematic mapping. And this is done by settler colonizers, and they are trying to, so the codes, you will have yellow colored areas indicate the areas that should be populated by European families. Red colored areas indicate the military positions they should be using. The white areas is the areas where it should be cultivated by Africans. Again, that's in the little explanation here. What is interesting is that this map was probably meant as a foundation of the new colonial system for Saint-Domingue that was actually connected with Napoleon's project to reestablish slavery to the island around that time. There was a revolt in 1802, and then in 1804, the independence of the former colony was declared by Jean-Jacques Dessalines. So this was a short-lived plan, never put into practice, but it's quite an interesting way of looking at how they use color codes to make the argument. Then now we are entering in the area where thematic mapping is a bit more established. The first ethnographic map can be traced to Prussia in 1828. There's a number of other similar examples of ethnographic maps, especially in the region. Actually, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian empires will be using the similar mapping. This one is from Élisée Reclus, an absolutely crazy, fascinating French geographer. He was also an anarchist. And produced a 19-volume on universal geography. So if you're interested, I went into that rabbit hole. It's actually a very, very interesting read. So what you see with this ethnographic mapping emerging in this time is they try to fix in the territory the specific ethnic groups with a specific color, right? And so they serve, as an author would say, ethnographic inventories of the imperial subject. What you see, so this map precisely, done around the 1870s, is about Romania, or the new kind of, the region that we call Romania and Bulgaria, right? Just at the border of the two. But you see in the Russian maps, for instance, the use of the color red, especially for the Slavic people. And red, following Goethe's theory of colors, is the beautiful color, right? So there's something political about the use of specific color here. Obviously, you won't see the Jewish population. You won't be seeing the Gypsy population mapped here. It's inherently political because imagine that all these areas are disputed, mixed. So the decision to make it yellow or red is one that will carry ramifications later on in terms of management of the territory itself. I'll move quickly now through two other maps that tend to be a little bit more well-known and on the later kind of scale of the thematic mapping development. This one is the iconic statistical mapping project of London by Charles Booth. So they are known as the descriptive maps of London poverty. And this was published as 17 volumes in 1902, 1903. So what is interesting here is that Charles Booth and his teams really went to every single street, mapping the streets and using a specific color codes to be describing the areas, right? It goes beyond just the poverty and relative incomes. There will be, for instance, black, the lowest class vicious semi-criminal here, can be separated from the very poor class, the dark blue, only when the researchers judge that there's a moral failing on the behalf of the population. And how do they do that? They actually use police notebooks. They have access to police notebooks. There's a fascinating new project now where you can actually find those maps, and they are basically embedded with the current map of London. It's quite interesting to see the contrast. Obviously, the areas where they tend to be the poorest areas now are quite chic and quite well developed in London, as you would imagine. But this is a project that really, again, is about the structuring of the space through the color codes, with clear ramifications as to if you are listed here in a black neighborhood, or if you are listed in a neighborhood or street that is understood as being morally decent. Finally, a project that is quite interesting is the Homeowners Loan Corporation, established in the 1930s in the US. and they produce a residential security maps for most of the cities in the US. So through this program, the American government was restricting lending to specific neighborhoods because of the social and racial considerations. There are 4 different levels, categories of qualities: first, second, third, and fourth, associated with the code letters, A, B, C, D, but also a color code: green, blue, yellow, and red is the area that is deemed the poorer. So in this system, it's not really about structural characteristics. It should be about the structural characteristics of the houses, but it's actually about the racial composition and ethnicity of the population. Basically, as a colleague, Orlando, said, it's based on undesired features: black, Jewish, Catholic, foreign, you're red. Okay? And this led to a practice that is called red lining, where it's a red zoning practice, which means restricting lending to specific neighborhoods. These practices carried massive ramifications for mostly black population in the US, restricting them access to the home owning kind of bonanza that happened in the US, access to these prices, and then so making sure that they will be staying in a poverty situation for the foreseeable future. So these practices have been restricted by the emergence of a regulatory apparatus in the 1960s, but they still obviously operate in other ways. Right, so that is a good transition from red and red lining to red zones, right? As I mentioned quickly a little bit, speak of the color red is almost like a pleonasm. Actually, in many different languages, red is synonymous with colored or beautiful. So it's the archetypical color in many societies, and it's also red, as I mentioned, also a color that is associated with danger, at least since the 18th century. The red flag, as you know, being waved to alert for danger. It only became the color of revolution, seemingly in 1791. I'm sure that George in the audience will know. But when the French authorities tried to disperse a demonstration against the king at that time, and they waved the red flag to warn the demonstrators, but there was actually quite a massacre that followed that. And then the revolutionaries used the red flag as a symbol for the revolution, and then it became associated with revolutionary movements. Red zoning has a long history. I did mention red lining practices in the US, but you can think of also policing inside the states, inside different states. In where I'm from, Canada, Kelowna, there's a red zone where if you are basically found guilty for possession or use of drugs, you cannot go back to a specific red zone after you're free. There are different types of these red zones in policing. In disaster risk management is the same thing. There will be a red zone around a volcano eruption, for instance. Travel advisories, as you know, governing the work of most of us as scholars. So you're following the travel advisory from DFAT. And so you will know that there are areas that will be coded red, which means you do not have access to these places. COVID-19 management was also using this color code. So in interventions in general, there are many examples. I just mentioned to you the Port-au-Prince red zone of Cité Soleil. But this one, weirdly enough, I'm talking about the green zone here in Baghdad. But what is interesting in Baghdad and Iraq is that what is not coded green is coded red, right? So that's a very interesting kind of association of the simultaneous color, as I did mention, okay? So the story of the green zone is actually a story of the red zone at the same time, right? So I'm currently working on the historicity of the green zone and red zones, and with a colleague who is Australian Iraqi. And so we're trying to kind of figure out when it started to be implemented, how it's mapping into also Saddam Hussein's Baghdad kind of geography before that. There's another also possibility of me doing field work in Central African Republic later on if Halane and my head of school allow me to go there, where it's really interesting where the UN is actually red zoning the different roads. So this is a very unique and other understanding of red zoning. So green, as per, like to give you another example, that's the Cyprus. So a green became then the thing or symbol for permission to pass or to freedom. But this permission to pass, obviously, is not universal. It is restricted. So it's a mobility of specific individuals. And this permission to pass might mean interdiction or restriction for others. And all these different areas will have different understanding of these restrictions. Iraq, Afghanistan will be harsher in terms of the presence. It will be more bunkerized. In Port-au-Prince, the red zone is also more part of the political geography of the city. And so it's a different restriction, a different physical fortification that is linked to that. We are interested here in the green zone of Cyprus that is basically that has been established in 1974 following the Turkish invasion. And seemingly, the story goes that green was the color of the pen used by the British commander to draw the line across the map, hence became the green zone. The zone varies widely in width, from few meters in certain urban areas like Lefkosa to several kilometers in rural regions. What we're interested here is the local resistance to this green zone or this cultural reappropriation of the green. So we are seeing a lot of greening strategies in Cyprus. So what we're interested in is how citizens reappropriated the color green and are using plants as symbols and gifting them across the border, across the green zone, right? So it's kind of a reappropriation of the color green and what we call greening strategies to kind of in a sense, resist in their own ways the mapping processes and reappropriate the map and all the ramifications that it has on their own everyday life. It's something that I've seen also in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince. There was a specific, I've interviewed a number of local groups and civil society actors, and they did a green day in Haiti, the heyday of the UN intervention. And in the red zone of Cité Soleil, they decided to wear green clothes, saying, you know what? We are reappropriating the color code here, okay? And here, we are not red anymore, we are green. They even pushed the envelope and organized a press conference and declaring to the world that the area is no longer red. Nothing had changed on the security maps. But they decided in a very kind of performativity, very Butlerian way of saying, you know what? We are changing the way that you are perceiving us, right? The UN was very confused, thinking, we haven't changed the map, what are you doing? They even wrote, they did a petition, local petition, collected names. They gave this to the Haitian Prime Minister, who is not at all, in charge of security coding for the UN, has no entry into that meeting, actually. But the Haitian Prime Minister decided to receive the petition, made a beautiful speech about the color green, means go, means freedom, means change in Haiti. Everyone is playing that part, but the security codes remain. But what is interesting here is how the local population also can react to these security mapping practices. So yeah, yellow is an example that we are also interested. So it's yellow was a prized color in the Middle Ages, but it became gradually devalued over the centuries, associated with envy, jealousy, duplicity, lying, treachery, and madness. Judas was, after all, depicted in representations of the Last Supper as wearing a yellow robe. So yellow's decline accelerated in the mid-19th century, and it's mostly now associated with the danger in signalization. It's actually quite interesting. Pastor is making the point, you won't see a lot of political parties using the color yellow as a color. There's a few examples, but most of them will actually shy away from yellow. And once you think about this, you cannot unsee this. So as I said, yellow also is part of the traffic light system quite recently, into the 40s and 1940s and 1950s. But yellow, if red was danger, yellow will be transition. Some of you will be stopping at the yellow light. Some of you will be trying to force your way through it, depending. My friend Catherine is on the other side. But it's what is interesting is how yellow is associated with transitions, the state of liminality or in-betweenness. So in banking terms, yellow is financial difficulty situated between the healthy financial standing, green zone, and the delinquency, red zones. In psychology terms, it's a space of conventional transgressions situated between the more serious moral transgressions that are red zone and the acceptable behavior that is the green zone, right? So if we have kids, sometimes if we really follow kind of conversation in the classroom with the teacher or something, it's one of the, sometimes they do use these color codes. In healthcare management during the recent COVID-19 pandemic, yellow zone was the buffer area inside the emergency department, in between the green zone, the clean area, and the red zone, the contaminated area. So here, again, this is the kind of use of the yellow as a zone that is buffering between what is basically the green zone in Port-au-Prince and the red zone. It's an area that has specific security ramification protocol associated to this. So in this case, in the case of Port-au-Prince, what it means is that you cannot be alone traveling through the yellow zone. In this transition, you need to be accompanied by another colleague. Windows up, doors locked, working radio accessible. But what is more interesting is that after 5 p.m., the yellow zone becomes red, right? What does that mean? It means for the local population living in this area, for the local hotel owners, for the restaurant owners, there's no access to this bonanza that is the UN intervention. When we talk about the bonanza of the UN intervention, in the heyday of in Port-au-Prince, we're talking about a budget of 700 million, right? So it's considerable money, right? One of the big UN missions in the world at that time. So this map is from 2014, 2015. And so, and this area, for instance, in Juma, is actually, you couldn't see the difference in between the streets, right? It's very similar. It's quite a nice little neighborhood, very quiet. So they just decided to follow the main kind of road that is as a distinguishing kind of feature between the yellow and the green zone. But these zones have massive ramifications. I met exhaustively with all the hotel owners in the yellow zone, trying to understand the local resistance to these practices. What is interesting is there's a specific hotel here that is very nice, Hotel Holofson, all made in wood, beautiful. And the owner, Richard Morse, is quite a fascinating character. He decided to tweet a lot about the yellow and green zone. Okay, very vocal about this, always saying, yeah, green means spend the money with the elite, blah, blah, blah. So he was really vocal about this, and basically told me in an interview that someone from the US Embassy came in and said, Richard, you would probably want to be in the green zone. You know that there's one thing that you can do in order to get to the green zone, stop tweeting, right? So it's got political maps. These thematic maps are very political, and they govern interventions, but they also govern the everyday of the local population. Blue, the color blue, was a color of peace as early as the Middle Ages. And seemingly there is a fundamental shift in the 13th century where blue, as progressively, according to Pastoureau, became the color of the Western civilization in general, maybe also associated with the preference for most people in the West with the color blue. This is not my favorite color, by the way. If you ask me, it will be purple. But I'm a marginal, I guess, it's not reflected in any of the surveys. It's the emblematic colors of most international, of very important international organizations, from the League of Nations to the European Union and the United Nations. And here, what we can see is Nairobi in Kenya. And this is the blue zone that's governing the political geography of the place. What is interesting here is that this structured the geography of the city, okay? Because we have an area that is restricted. So if you are working for the UN, normally in Kenya, and Kenya is one of the local African hub for the UN, so there's a lot of agencies operating in Kenya, and a lot of officials. You have to actually stay in the blue zone, okay? What happened, the story of the blue zone is actually a fascinating story. Again, just sorry, little aparté. Blue is also understood, weirdly enough, as also an association with red, right? When blue was established as the color of the UN, it was in order to distinguish the color red, which is the color of war and conflict, right? So what is interesting here is that the main blue zone, this is a slightly different kind of story, but this main here zone, and so we did a lot of ethnographic kind of field work in the local neighborhoods of Gigiri and Runda, which are the kind of local neighborhoods that are covered by the blue zone. What is interesting in this area is that this area was gifted by the first president of Kenya to the UN in order to enlist the UN to establish themselves in Kenya. There were kind of like some tractation. South Africa also wanted to have the UN hub, the UN presence in their country, but President Kenyatta actually gave them the land. The land was a plantation owned by a British settler and a coffee plantation, so they obviously compensated the settler. But what is interesting is what happens to the local people, the coffee pickers, right? The coffee pickers lived in this area. Obviously, you don't want to be too far from your place of work. And they still live. So we've been doing these kind of focus groups with these populations. And they are living in the difficult areas inside the blue zones. So they are known as local red zones inside the blue zones. Okay? And the same families of coffee pickers now work for very rich people living in the blue zones as maids, security personnel. Some of them also ride a motorcycle, the taxi motorcycles. And they are heavily policed. They are quite unhappy with the new regulations. Before that, with the plantation system, they will be able to walk freely in between. Now, they are constantly stopped and searched. If you are riding a local motor taxi, there's even visual recognition software that you use. And you have to give your biometric details to the local police stations, and you followed, like all the credentials are followed. So it's quite interesting to see this kind of complex intermingling between the red and the blue inside the blue zone, but also how this has obviously kind of colonial, post-colonial ramifications associated to that. So that's something that I'm just back from Kenya, and that's something that I found really quite interesting and insightful to kind of understand how the blue zone is associated and embedded in this kind of political geography, but also has a massive repercussion on the geography of the city itself. Finally, I know that I'm running out of time. I'll be very quick because we are just starting on this color, is the association of black and white. Again, associated to the law of contrasting colors, and even white disappeared as a color because of Newton, but before that was seen as a color in its own right. And so there are a number of examples of white zones or black zones. In colonial India, for instance, there were white-only neighborhoods in Pretoria. So that kind of constitutes the background of the use of white and black in thematic mapping, for instance, or in mapping of different cities. But here we are going a little bit beyond. It's kind of an opening for us towards like beyond mapping, in a sense, where we are interested in Afghanistan. There's something that is called White City. Okay, and White City is the highest security protocol in the UN in Afghanistan at that time. It means that all movement of UN staff is immediately suspended, basically bunker where you are, okay? It's also the name of an Afghan music band, if you're interested. It's actually quite good. So if you can look this up on YouTube, White City. But it goes to show how it's also understood in the local culture as, it goes beyond just the kind of UN security protocols. So that's something that we are interested in understanding, is kind of white, but also there's something going on with the black and the blue UN. Okay, so here you can see the different colors. Normally, the black UN are the organs or the institutions of the UN which are a little bit more associated with the military kind of side of the UN, right? The blue UN is the humanitarian side of the UN. So they're trying to contrast this. I'm quite sure that insurgents in Afghanistan wouldn't be able to really see the difference or do not care about the difference, to be honest. But it's quite an interesting way into how this use of color kind of goes beyond the territory of the zoning, but it's also enforcing it part of the daily life of UN officials. All right, so I think I'll stop there. Welcome questions and comments. As I said, it's work in progress, so any comments, any suggestions will be really welcome. And I am also inviting you, the next professional lecture by my colleague, Lou Glenville, on the 29th of May, so you can register right there. Thank you very much.